And in the New Testament, we find God come into history in the person of Jesus, and his invitation to people is for them to trust him. The words we find translated variously throughout the New Testament scriptures are to put faith in, to believe in, but it all has the same root meaning, which is to trust, to have confidence in the goodness and the sufficiency of God. So this whole story is about God inviting us into this relationship of trust. Now, here's what we know, because we know how relationships work, and we've done relationships, and we know how this God thing works, because most of us have tried out or trying to do this God thing. We know that the trust thing is a hard thing. And oftentimes in churches and versions of Christianity and Christian traditions, often trust is introduced as this thing that you just, kind of like a switch that you flip, that you go from not trusting and you just flip the switch and then you trust. And once you trust, like everything just falls into place. But Jesus said, trust, it's a lot less like a switch that you flip, and a lot more like a mustard seed, right? Something that starts out small and grows. And the thing about a seed is you don't just decide for a seed to grow and it grows. The way that seeds work is you provide the conditions that nurture and allow for growth. And when you create those conditions, the most natural thing in the world for that seed to do is grow. In faith, belief, or what we call trust works the same way. That our relationship of trust with God isn't a switch that we flip, but it's a condition that we nurture. And as we actively nurture this inward condition of trust in God, the most natural thing in the world that results is that we grow in relationship with God. That seed grows, that trust grows. And so we spend a lot of time in our community here talking about is how do we nurture the conditions that allow that trust to grow? Because what we recognize is that trust is what actually leads us into transformation. It's what allows the image of God, the image of the divine that is in each and every single one of us to come into fullness. And the result of that fullness, as we trust God and the image of God becomes manifest in us, the outworking of that is love. So that's why this is called From Trust with Love, because God is working to restore this condition of trust that when it's restored, the outworking of that is love, transformation. And so the question that we're always answering is, how do we trust? How do we learn to trust? Now, like so many attributes, there is a long-term growth process, but there's also a moment-to-moment growth process. And we can understand this really well when we think about things like growing in patience, right? We can grow in patience in the long term, but there's also the moment-to-moment exercise of patience, right? And we know this. We can become more patient people over time, but it means we also have to exercise patience in the moment-to-moment. And the more we exercise patience in the moment-to-moment, what happens over the long term? We become more patient people. In the same way, trust works in the short term and the long term. As we learn to foster and nurture trust in God in the moment-to-moment, in the day-to-day, come and go, give and take circumstances of life, we learn to trust God in the moment-to-moment. Over the long term, our capacity for trust in God grows. And so it's the moment-to-moment that we're spending this entire summer talking about. It's what we spent all last month talking about, is how do we nurture that trust in the moment-to-moment so that over the long term it grows. And so last month we talked about one of the practices, or one of the, we also often call an internal posture that allows for that moment-to-moment trust, is this thing called self-awareness. And self-awareness is simply just building our capacity to take our lens that tends to be focused outward and turn that lens inward. A core practice for fostering trust in the moment-to-moment. We talked about it. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because we talked about it enough. But it's a core practice. If you missed that, I encourage you to check it out on YouTube. Go back and see the importance of self-awareness, because it's going to feed into what we're talking about this month. Now, if you were with us for that portion of our journey where we were talking about self-awareness, and if you took that seriously and started building self-awareness processes and practices into your life, you might have been shocked at what you discovered. Because one of the tools that we offered last month was this concept of, my marker doesn't work. We talked about the concept of the line and developing self-awareness by being able to notice at any point in time if we are above or below the line. I'm not going to unpack this completely today. If you missed it, I encourage you to go back and watch the first lesson of our last portion of this series. But when we're in an above-the-line state, we call that a state of trust. Right? That's the thing that we're trying to nurture and cultivate in the moment-to-moment. It's that sense of openness, of peace, of joy. It's when we have access to our internal resources of connection and compassion and creativity, all of those good things. We just feel like everything's okay. This is going to be okay. That is the state of trust. And the antithesis to that is a state of fear. And a state of fear is when we feel contracted, and we feel reserved, and we feel protective, and we're pulling back. We're a little bit defensive. We're a little bit more reactive. In a state of fear, instead of being open and connecting, we tend to be more irritated. It might come out as anger. It might come out as control. It might come out as worry or anxiety. And we all know what that feels like. And so this is the tool that we use, that if we want to cultivate trust in the moment-to-moment, well, in the moment-to-moment, we have to be able to know what state we're in. So, if you started cultivating, and I hope you did, and if you did, it's not too late. If you started cultivating a practice of self-awareness, you may have found and been surprised to have found the state you were in, maybe more often than not, was a state of fear. That maybe more often than not, you found yourself below the line than you found yourself above the line. And maybe you were shocked, like how often you found yourself below the line. It's like, wow, like I'm in this state that I don't want to be in more often than I ever realized. And it doesn't mean that you're below the line more often than you were before. You're just noticing more than you did before, right? And so this is good. This is an important thing because we want to be aware of that. The question we want to start asking is, well, if that's the first step, is identifying where we are so that we can be here more often than here, but in reality we're finding ourselves here right now more often than here, then when we find ourselves here, what do we do? What do we do to get back to here? We might ask it this way. What causes us to shift below the line? Like, what are the things that happen that cause us to go from a state of trust to a state of fear or a state of threat? What are those things that cause us to shift below the line? And while you're thinking about it, I'm going to suggest something, and you don't have to agree with this, but just consider it. that isn't it when reality isn't what we'd wish it to be? Aren't the things that cause us to shift from here to here, is it when reality isn't what we'd wish it to be? Right? When the things that happen in life just aren't the way that we would want them to be? Like when we get passed over for the promotion and somebody else gets it who took credit for the work that we did, like don't we wish that would be different than it is? When your boss is just so manipulative or so controlling, right? You just wish they weren't. You just wish they were different. You wish your kids would just listen to you, if they just would just take your advice and do it the first time. You just wish it was different, right? You wish you weren't aging, right? You wish things weren't starting to break down. You wish you had more income. You wish you had more marginal income. You wish you had more flexibility in your life. You wish you had more vacation time. You wish the vacation that you were on wasn't coming to an end. You wish that guy hadn't cut you off in traffic, but he did. You wish that your partner would just be honest with you and just tell you what they were thinking, right? You wish that diagnosis hadn't come. You wish mom and dad were doing okay. You wish the house were clean. Isn't it the things, right? Isn't what causes us to go from above the line to below the line? Isn't it just when reality isn't what we wish it would be? Like, isn't it just that simple? And maybe we could put those things that aren't the way that we wish they'd be, simplify it. We could put them into maybe 3 categories, right? When we aren't who we wish we would be, those moments when you get so frustrated with yourself because you find yourself making the same mistake over and over again, and you just wish you weren't that person. Or you look at yourself in the mirror, and you don't like who you see, and you just wish you weren't that person. How we show up in the world. Or when we wish other people would be different than they are. Just wish they'd be more honest. Just wish they'd be more responsible. Just wish they'd take better care of themselves. Just wish they weren't so manipulative. Just wish they didn't always have to have the last word. When we wish other people were different than they are. Or when we wish our circumstances would be different than they were. Just wish I had that better job. I just wish we weren't in this neighborhood. I just wish their health was better. I just wish I weren't in this position. I just wish how we show up, how others show up, and how life tends to show up. And we wish that it weren't. And isn't it true? Maybe that the reason we wish those things weren't the way that they are, because somehow, in some way, we see those things as a threat, which is why they cause us to shift below the line. That some way, somehow, we see them as a threat to our ability to just be okay. We see them as a threat to how we want to see ourselves, a threat to how we want to identify ourselves, a threat to the affirmation that we need, a threat to what we believe we deserve from other people, a threat to what we believe we deserve from life, a threat to what we think we need in order to be happy, in order to be content, in order to have enough, in order to be satisfied. That the way that we show up, the way that others show up, the way that our circumstances tend to show up in our lives tend to be a threat to our ability to be okay. We find ourselves shifting below the line to a state of fear and protectiveness and defensiveness and wishing things weren't the way they are, wishing that people weren't the way they are, wishing we weren't the way that we are. Now, here's the thing about wishing. When inwardly we're wishing things to be different, when we find ourselves wishing, what we're doing is resisting resisting the way we are, resisting the way others are, and resisting the way reality actually is. Resist it. Resist it. Resist it. And we enter into this state of threat. And we do, in that state of threat, in that below-the-line state, we do what we always do, what we're programmed to do, what your caveman brain does. You fight, or you flight, or you freeze. Right? These are the things that we do, right? When life doesn't show up the way that we want it to be, we resist, we either fight it, and we've seen ourselves engage those strategies for fighting against and trying to control and trying to make things the way that they should be and trying to make people the way that they should be. Or we flee from it, we try to get away from it, we ignore it, we deny it, or we engage in the strategy of just wishing it were different. I just wish that were different. We just hold on to it as if focusing on it is going to change it. Become fixated on the thing that we wish were different. We just freeze so often. There's just that learned hopelessness. There's that feeling of just always going to be this way. There's nothing that I can do. We just enter into that tailspin of just learned helplessness. There's nothing that I can do. I get stuck in this place, wishing things were different than they are. Here's what we know about these strategies, these fear-driven, fear-based strategies for engaging life, for engaging others, for engaging ourselves. We don't show up the way that we think we should. They can produce results. And you know this. Fear-driven strategies can produce some short-term results. It comes with a lot of baggage in the long term, doesn't it? It comes with internal disintegration. It comes with relational disintegration. It comes with increased friction as we try to control our circumstances and the people around us. And in the long term, nothing gets solved. And often, more things get hurt and damaged than get resolved. So if what causes us to find ourselves here is when reality is other than what we wish it to be, then what do you do when things are different than what you would choose? When we find ourselves in this state, resisting the way that things are because they're not what we would want them to be, and of course they're not what we want them to be, well, what do we do then? And the good news, maybe, is this isn't a new problem. We aren't the first generation to face this problem of sometimes life doesn't go your way problem, right? This is a problem that's as old as problems. And what's so fascinating about this is that 2,000 years ago, and this problem wasn't new then either, 2,000 years ago, a follower of Jesus, a first century Jew named Paul, writes into this piece of wisdom that is so easily overlooked and so easily misunderstood, but is so fascinating and maybe a little bit uncomfortable. We're going to be looking at the perspective that comes from a first century follower of Jesus named Paul. And what makes Paul's insight into this experience, our experience, what makes his insight into this so fascinating is that Paul was, as many of you know, persecuting the early church, persecuting followers of Jesus, putting followers of Jesus in prison, was on his way to put followers of Jesus in prison when he met the resurrected Jesus and became a follower of Jesus and went from persecutor of followers of Jesus to expanding the Jesus movement throughout the Roman Empire. And Christian historians, non-Christian historians, all together look back at Paul's life and say, I don't know, something must have happened. Something must have happened to transform this person's life so radically that they went from persecuting the movement to being a perpetuator of this movement. What Paul would say is like, well, I told you, I met the resurrected Jesus, And if you did, it would change your life too. So Paul met the resurrected Jesus, which gives his perspective into life and our issues and the things that we confront, makes his perspective a little bit more special than the average perspective, right? Because when you meet someone who predicted and pulled off their own death and resurrection, well, I'd value your opinion too. And if you did, I'd love to hear it, but if you didn't, we'll just hear what Paul has to say. And what Paul has to say is really fascinating because he's writing this letter, because we're talking about when life is different than you choose and it's not the way that you would want it to be. Paul's like the epitome of this. He's writing this letter to a group of followers of Jesus in a city called Philippi, and he's writing this letter from prison, right? From prison. And Paul's going to speak into this idea of what do you do when life is different than you'd choose. So he writes in this letter from prison, and they had just sent Paul, because Paul had been with them, he'd taught them, he helped create the church, or start the church in Philippi, then he'd gone on to another city where he was arrested. So he's writing them this letter. And they had just sent him a gift, a financial gift, to show them how much they appreciated him and to in some way care for him and meet his needs while he's in prison. So he's writing them this letter that's kind of a status update / thank you letter. And we're getting to the thank you portion of the letter. And here's what Paul says. He says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last, I mean, a little tongue-in-cheek there, like turning the fork to the side. At last, you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. So Paul's saying, like, I knew that you'd been wanting to get this gift together. I knew you'd been meaning to do it. You finally did it. I really thank you. I really appreciate it. They're like, of course, of course. I mean, you're in prison. We're glad that we can send this to you to cheer you up and make you feel a little better. And Paul says, well, just hold on there for a second, because listen, I'm not saying this because I'm in need. I'm not saying thank you because I was so in need and you provided this for me. It was like such a relief. But I've learned, he says, I've learned to be content, which is a really fascinating word. And we'll explain that in a second. Learn to be content, whatever the circumstances. So whatever the circumstances were, whatever my external circumstances were, however life showed up out here, I've learned to be content. Regardless of what's happening out here, I've learned to be content. And I'll just imagine that you're the Philippians who've received this letter from Paul, this, at this point, old man who's in prison. And as he understood it, he was waiting to be executed in prison. And Paul's telling them, hey, I've learned to be content no matter what. They'd be like, you're in prison. Like, I know, but I'm good. Like, but you're waiting to be executed. I know, that's all right. I'm content. They're like, what are we missing here? Because most of us aren't content and none of us are in prison. Most of us aren't content and none of us are waiting to be executed, right? What is it that you know, Paul, that we don't know? Paul says, look, I know what it is to be in need. Trust me. I spent most of my life in need. Paul wrote about this in some of his letters. He spent his life on the run, being hunted down, shipwrecked, like just all kinds of horrible things. Like, I know what it is to be in need. And I know what it is to have plenty. It's like, I've been in both places. It's not like I don't know what it is to have a lot. I don't know what it is to, it's not like I don't know what it is to be without. It's like, I've been in both places, but here's what I know. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I've learned the secret of being content. Now, Greek word content is a really interesting word choice that Paul picks here. It's this Greek word autarkes. And these two places, interestingly, for you Bible nerds, are not saying that you are, but those of you who are, you know who you are, the only two places that word shows up in the whole Bible. I mean, you'd think that you'd go through the Bible and find content everywhere. You think the Bible would be littered with this word like content, because who doesn't want to be content? But this specific Greek word, autarkes, only shows up in these two places. What's fascinating about this is that while we don't find this concept just flowing through Scripture, where we do find it abundantly is in the teaching of Stoic philosophers. All right? So Stoic philosophers taught this idea of autarkes, which just meant this internal capacity to be content no matter what. It was like this self-contained joy, this self-contained happiness that inwardly I carry with me sufficiency to be satisfied no matter what's happening outside of me. And for the Stoic philosopher, cultivating that contentment, cultivating that autarkes, is the whole goal of life. It was living virtuously in alignment with the way of nature, the way of things, what they called the logos, that when you live in alignment with the nature of things virtuously, you cultivate this contentment, this autarkes. Now, they also identified, the Stoic philosophers did, that what disrupts this autarkes, this self-contained joy and peace and equanimity, what disrupts that is when we wish reality were different than it is. They identified that when we live in resistance to the way that our circumstances show up, when we live in resistance to the way that other people show up in our lives, when we live in resistance to who we are, it disrupts this thing called autarkes. And what they say is that it ignites the passions, which they described as fear, as anger, as jealousy, as envy, as worry, as anxiety. That when we resist the way that reality is, it creates these passions within us that undoes this thing that we're supposed to be working towards, which is contentment. Now, here's the fascinating thing. This is this. It's such a weird teaching because it's so counterintuitive. Because if you or I sat down to map out a strategy for how to fix discontentment, our own strategy for how we would deal with the things that aren't the way that we want them to be, this isn't what we would come up with. Nobody would come up with this because it doesn't make any sense at all. What the Stoic philosophers said was the solution to when we wished life was other than it was, when we were resisting reality as it is. They said the solution was, I'll write it down because it's just ridiculous. Let's write resist down here because we all get that. We all get resisting reality. They said the solution to restore autarkes, the solution to restore contentment is acceptance. Is just the practice of allowing reality to be as it is. That's it. The Stoic philosophers taught and emphasized if one can just learn to accept reality as it is, that person will experience autarkes or contentment. And that contentment will lead to virtue and the fullness of life, the good life. In fact, one Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, said it this way. This is like the most extreme form of acceptance. He said, seek not that the things which happen should be as you wish. Like, don't desire for what happens to be what you want it to be. And don't desire for things that happen to be different than they are. But instead, wish the things which happen to be as they are. And you will have a tranquil flow of life. That whatever happens in your life, however life occurs, however life comes up, however other people show up in your life, however you are, like the best thing you can do is actually wish that things were that way. That you would wish that reality is just as it is. And for the Stoics, this is interesting, for the Stoics, this came from this belief that behind reality is this wisdom of the universe. And for the Stoic philosopher, accepting reality as it is was trusting the wisdom of the universe. So, let's go back to our friend Paul, who's in prison waiting to be executed. He said, I've learned the secret of contentment, which was like this really Stoic way of thinking, this really Stoic way of life where you just accept reality as it is. He's like, I've learned this secret. And his readers would have been like, I thought you were a Christian. This sounds really Stoic. What is this? Paul said, I hear you, but those Stoics, they stumbled onto something real, right? Their discovery of this thing called autarkies, their discovery of this thing called acceptance instead of resistance to reality, it's like they've actually stumbled on to how life actually works. This is actually the thing that brings contentment. This is actually the thing that allows us to shift into a state of trust. He's like, these Stoics, they actually got this right. They stumbled on to one of the principles of the universe. He's like, but the news is even better than they thought. Because the reason we can accept reality as it is, Paul says, the reason I have this secret power, the reason I can do this, the reason I can be content no matter what, the reason I can accept reality no matter what and still find joy and still find peace and still find, the reason I can do that, the reason I have that power in me, and Paul would imply, and the reason you have that power in you, even better than the Stoics thought. That I can do all this through Him, Christ, who gives me strength. You know why I can just allow reality to be as it is? Like, because the Stoics, they thought there was just like this invisible, blind force that was somehow governing all things. Paul's like, they were partway right, but that force isn't blind. It's not detached. In fact, it's a person. And I met him. And he's good. In fact, he's so good that when I was persecuting his followers, he called me out and invited me in. He's not just good, he's generous. He's benevolent. But this isn't just some blind force. That behind everything, over and above and behind and holding all things is this God who's fully and completely good. And he's made himself known to us in the person of Jesus. Paul said, and I talked to some of the people who knew him firsthand too. And they watched how he loved. That he loved people who were nothing like him, and they loved him back, and he invited them in. And he stood up for them, and he provided for them, and he protected them, and he cared for them, and he loved them. In fact, he loved them so much that he laid his life down for them and picked it back up again to prove that he was who he claimed to be, that he was, in fact, the Creator God. The most amazing thing about that isn't that Jesus was God, the kind of God that exposed him to be. The God of self-sacrificial, generous, benevolent love and kindness. Paul's saying, if that kind of God is the God who is over and above and beyond and responsible for all things, we can trust that kind of God in all things. That kind of God wouldn't let us go through anything that he couldn't use restoratively. That kind of God wouldn't allow any kind of circumstances that he wouldn't use redemptively. That kind of God would never just abandon us to chaos and evil and suffering that doesn't have some ultimate redemptive purpose. That kind of God is too good. He's too kind. He's too loving. He's too merciful. He'd never allow things to just happen to us on a whim. Oh, that God is using it. He's using it. And so when we look at the way that life shows up, it's not the way that we want it to be. When we look at the way that people show up, and they're not what we want them to be. When we look at the way that we show up in life, and we're not the way that we want to be, Paul would say, oh, but he's so good. And when you see his goodness, when you see his grace, when you see that he accepts you just as you are, that the internalization of that is to be able to accept ourselves just as we are. It's your superpower. And when you understand that he loves you just as you are, and you learn to love others just as they are, to accept them just as they are, oh, it's your superpower. When circumstances show up, when life doesn't go the way that we expect it to go, we're just stuck in these situations that we just can't get ourselves out of. Paul's like, God is working through that. Don't you know? He works in all things for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose, fashioning them into the image and likeness of his Son, Jesus Christ. Don't you know that God is working there? You can just welcome those circumstances. You can welcome life as it shows up because there's a good God working in it and through it restoratively and redemptively. Paul's like, our secret power, there's a good God. Whatever happens, whatever comes, instead of resisting life, instead of resisting the way that other people, instead of resisting the way that we are, we live with this internal posture of openness and acceptance where we welcome reality just as it is. This is the practice of acceptance. It's fueled and motivated by the goodness of God revealed in the person of Jesus. Acceptance. And we can so easily misunderstand this thing of acceptance. We can hear acceptance as passiveness, where we just never engage in life. We never try to change ourselves. We never try to help other people, but that's not what acceptance is. We can hear acceptance as allowing ourselves to be victimized, but that's not what acceptance is. We can hear acceptance as just being a doormat, to be treated by other people however they want to treat us, but that's not what acceptance is. And we'll get into all of those things as we get into the next couple lessons in this series. None of those things are what acceptance are, but what acceptance is, it's just allowing reality to be as it is. Instead of living resistantly to reality, we just allow reality to be as it is. We allow our circumstances to just be as they are. To allow other people to be as they are. To allow ourselves to be who we are. Here's the reality. You can't, most of the time, change the way that your circumstances are. You can't change the way other people are. We'll get into this at the end of this series. You can't change who you are in this moment now. It sounds a little befuddling, but we'll unpack that further when we get there. Acceptance is allowing reality to just be as it is. Acceptance is the exercise of trust. Acceptance is the decision to trust God with reality as it is. God, these are the circumstances that you have me in right now. Instead of resisting it, I'm going to trust you in it. I'm going to trust that you're doing something in me, in these circumstances, right here, right now. God, I'm trusting you in this relationship with this other person. Just keeps, they don't, but they always. I'm just going to trust you in this relationship with this person. God, I find this in my life over and over again. I'm just going to trust you here with this. Acceptance, the reason acceptance is the antidote to fear is because acceptance is the step of trust. Acceptance is making the decision, God, I'm going to trust you with reality as it's showing up. And acceptance is giving attention to God's activity here. Acceptance is the decision that instead of turning away from, instead of resisting the way reality is, I'm going to give attention to how God is wanting to work right here. The thing that happens in resistance, when we resist reality as it is, when we resist, we so often miss what God is wanting to do in our life, in our relationships, and within us, and the moment to moment, and the day to day. Acceptance is taking that step into our lives, into reality, into ourselves, into our relationships, where God can then begin to work. If you want contentment in your life, if you want contentment despite your circumstances, if you want the contentment, the kind of contentment that Paul experienced sitting in a prison, waiting to be executed, where he had enough, if you want that kind of contentment, practice acceptance. It is the act of trust. Here's the truth about acceptance. It is just often really hard to swallow, is that the practice of acceptance can feel brutal, depending upon the circumstances that you're in. Because we have such resistance to accept the things that are being placed before us. Such difficult things that show up in our lives. Just the losses, the grief, the hurt, the things that have been taken from us, the things that have been done to us. To ask someone to accept those things is a big ask. I get it. And as we get into this series, we're going to unpack how hard some of these things can be to accept. The reality is, when we find ourselves down here, when we find ourselves below the line, that's an indication there's something in my life that I'm resisting, that God is inviting me to accept. And when I do, there's healing that he's going to do there. There's restoration that he's going to do there. And as long as we resist it, we miss it. We miss the work that God is wanting to do in us. Acceptance is so critical to restoring trust. So last month, the reason we emphasized self-awareness over and over and over is that self-awareness brings attention to that which needs acceptance. It's the self-awareness of knowing where I am, above or below the line, that draws my attention to the things that need acceptance. When I find myself below the line, that is the indicator that there's something I'm resisting, that God is inviting me to accept. Like I said, oftentimes the things that God invites us to accept, it feels brutal. Oh, there can be so intimidating. Try to accept some of the things that we've spent maybe our lives resisting. We just put it off and put it off and put it off and put it off. But there's something God is inviting us into here. We're going to spend the next 3 weeks unpacking this, talking about how we can learn to accept those things that in our moment to moment are just so easy to resist, how to accept those things that maybe our whole lives we've spent resisting, how to learn to accept reality as it is, because it's here that God is wanting to do in you a deep work of healing and restoration, that you can live in the moment to moment, day to day, from a place of trust that produces love. Because you are the light of the world. You have the image of God within you. And for that to shine, for the rest of the world to see, for that to shine, for the rest of the world to be drawn to, there's healing that God wants to do in you through this practice, acceptance. Your practice step, your practical step out of this continue the work of self-awareness, and then begin to give attention when you find yourself in a state of fear, when you find yourself below the line, to begin to bring attention to what is it I'm resisting in this moment. Second action step. Come back for the rest of this series as we unpack how to practice accepting the things that we tend to resist. You guys pray with me. Father, we are so grateful for you. That you would go to the lengths that you've gone to prove your love for us. That in this life, there's just so much hurt, so much loss. There's just so much grief where we find ourselves in these situations and these circumstances that we just can't seem to get ourselves out of. That we can know, that we can know. You never leave us, never forsake us. Never abandon us. We can live with confidence knowing that even in the worst, you are at work. Doing a work of redemption, work of restoration. That we can lean into you. We pray that you would draw us close to you as we begin to explore this concept of acceptance. It can be so difficult. Can require us to give up or to let go of things that we've been holding on to for so long. Draw us in close to you to feel your comfort, feel your compassion as we do this work with you. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.